What the hell are this Labour government doing?
I recognise...
Order! I'm not satisfied. I think that's the key, because both backbenchers, quite rightly, should hear it first. I don't care.
Awful April. The Labour Party promised not to tax working people.
Towards a financial disaster.
The nation stood frozen in disbelief. Cameras rolled, members of Parliament sat in stunned silence, and the Speaker's voice pierced through the chaos like a blade. I hereby recognise Nigel Farage as the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The words thundered across the House of Commons, shaking the chamber to its core. Sir Keir Starmer did not move. He couldn't. The man once known for his composed, steely gaze now blinked in visible panic and disbelief. Within moments, the illusion of Labour dominance lay in ruins. The very man once dismissed as a political outsider had not only entered Westminster, he had brought its edifice crashing down around him. Starmer's own MPs had begun to turn. Calls for his resignation echoed in hushed tones through the corridors of power. What had just unfolded was not a mere political upset, it was a seismic shift, a full-scale democratic reckoning that had blindsided even the most seasoned of observers. The day had begun like any other in Parliament. Starmer entered the chamber with his characteristic rigid posture and carefully rehearsed rhetoric. Outwardly confident, the Labour leader was inwardly beleaguered, cornered by scandal, unrest, plummeting polls, and mounting internal pressure. Then came Nigel Farage, louder, sharper, and far more formidable than many had dared imagine. This was no mere comeback. Farage had not returned to politics for nostalgia. He came to finish what he had started. Outside Westminster, his popularity had been steadily growing, but today marked the moment he stepped into power. He was no longer a fringe figure. He was centre stage, trailed by cameras and surrounded by a swelling faction of MPs who had lost faith in Starmer's leadership. The benches that once resounded with Labour's cheers now felt cold, hushed, and hollow. Whispers travelled like wildfire through the chamber. A shift was imminent. Starmer rose to speak, clearing his throat, launching into a laboured defence of Labour's vision. But the moment was already lost. As he stood, Farage stood as well. In an instant, the attention of the entire House shifted. It was as though power itself had passed, visibly, tangibly, from one man to another. The Speaker saw it. The backbenches felt it. And deep within himself, so did Starmer. Then the unthinkable occurred. The Speaker rose. A silence, heavy and electric, fell upon the chamber. Then, in a voice calm yet unequivocal, he pronounced the words that shattered the Labour illusion. In light of the circumstances, and with the will of the House now clear, I hereby recognise Mr. Nigel Farage as the rightful leader prepared to form the next government. Gasps erupted. One MP dropped their pen. Others stared at one another in silent disbelief. Starmer turned pale. His lips quivered. He sank slowly into his seat, as if crushed by the sheer weight of what had just occurred. This was not a vote. It was not a debate. It was a declaration. And it was final. Farage did not gloat. He did not smile. Instead, he turned to Starmer and delivered what would be remembered as one of the most scathing parliamentary speeches in recent memory. Mr. Speaker, he began, his voice steely and clear, for too long, this House has been ruled by frauds, technocrats, and careerists who have forgotten the people. They forgot the working class, the struggling pensioners, the silenced majority. Today, that ends. Each word struck like a blow. Starmer had no defence. The Labour front bench remained motionless, no one rose to defend him. No one spoke. Farage pressed on, denouncing Labour's broken promises, its coziness with banks and lobbyists, and the surveillance agenda revealed only days prior. He condemned a government that had, in his words, betrayed every voter who once believed in change. Then came the line that broke Starmer entirely. You were never elected to lead the people. You were placed here to manage their silence. And with that, Starmer's composure shattered. He blinked rapidly. His face collapsed inward, not in tears, but something near enough. The cameras captured a man watching his legacy disintegrate live before a nation. Farage turned to the benches and declared, "I will form a government not to manage decline, but to reclaim this country for its people. We will no longer be ruled by the few while millions suffer." That ends now. The chamber erupted, not with applause, but with a frenzied energy. Some cheered. Others booed. Many sat in silence, struggling to comprehend what had just unfolded. But the damage was done. The shift was complete. Farage had risen. Starmer had fallen. And the Speaker had just altered the course of British history. This was not a debate. It was a reckoning. Nigel Farage had not seized power through force or manipulation. He had revealed the hollowness of the system, and millions across the country were cheering him on. The Labour front bench was in a state of collapse. Rachel Reeves exited the chamber wordlessly, her complexion ashen and unreadable. Wes Streeting attempted to speak to the press, only to be drowned out by chants of "traitor" and "no mandate" from furious protesters. One by one, Labour's so-called rising stars crumbled beneath the weight of public contempt. Promises made with polished sound bites were now held up against a grim national reality, punishing tax rises, crumbling public services, spiraling national debt, and an intrusive surveillance agenda that had chilled the working class to the bone. Starmer's leadership had been pitched as stable, composed, and grown up. But in the end, it was unmasked, cold, lifeless, arrogant, and catastrophically out of touch. Farage, meanwhile, moved swiftly. He did not assert control with rage or bluster. He spoke with clarity. His words, delivered in Parliament, had resonated across the nation. He didn't require spin doctors or fabricated emotion. He simply gave voice to what many already knew in their hearts: the old political order had failed, and Sir Keir Starmer had been its final, feeblest representative. Outside Number 10, crowds began to swell. Union Jacks fluttered in the summer air. Placards read, "Farage now," and "We want our country back." What had begun as a parliamentary statement was evolving into a movement in the streets. Police presence increased. Barricades were hastily erected. Yet, there was no violence, only a rising tide of political energy from a public sensing, perhaps for the first time in years, that the winds were changing. Behind closed doors, within the Speaker's private quarters, urgent meetings convened. Senior figures from across the political spectrum arrived, some red-faced with fury, others exchanging measured handshakes. Though bound by law to impartiality, the Speaker had done what many in Westminster had feared for months: he had recognised not just the will of the House, but the unmistakable will of the people. He invoked precedent, constitutional principle, and, most crucially, the sovereign authority of Parliament itself. There would be no reversal. No procedural misstep. No behind-the-scenes rescue. It was finished. Starmer was finished. Back in the Commons chamber, the mood shifted further. Labour MPs avoided each other's gaze. Some quietly gathered their documents. Even Starmer's staunchest defenders seemed to recognise they were defending a ghost. Farage remained seated, composed, calm, unshaken. There was no need to raise his voice. The tide had already turned. One final Labour MP stood to protest, murmuring something about procedure, legitimacy, and protocol. But the intervention faltered almost immediately. The Speaker replied with icy precision. "The House has spoken, and the nation is watching." It was a message meant not only for MPs, but for every citizen at home, in their workplaces, watching through their screens. The political elite no longer controlled the narrative. The people did. Starmer had once stood at the dispatch box as the man who promised dignity, decency, and order. But in the eyes of the electorate, he had delivered control, surveillance, and enforced silence. He called it leadership. The public called it betrayal. And Farage, divisive though he may be, had become the hammer that shattered that illusion. As Starmer exited the chamber, reporters surged. Microphones were thrust in his face. "Mr. Starmer, do you still consider yourself Prime Minister?" one journalist demanded. There was no reply. There could be none. His voice had been replaced by history, and history had already moved on. the Speaker's declaration reverberated far beyond the walls of Westminster. The Labour Party plunged into chaos. At Labour HQ, emergency meetings were demanded, while internal communication channels descended into virtual battlegrounds. Whips scrambled to assert control. But it was all too late. The political ground beneath their feet had given way. The truth had finally landed like a sledgehammer. Keir Starmer was no longer seen as a leader, not by the people, not by Parliament, and not even by his own party. He had become a liability. A man who had promised a return to competence, but delivered instead confusion, fragility, and fear. Inside Labour headquarters, staffers were seen leaving early, faces tight with stress, phones pressed to ears. Senior strategists were already pointing fingers, some blaming Angela Rayner, others Rachel Reeves. Some whispered that Starmer himself had ignored every warning, dismissed every sign. But the truth was starker still. The party had spent too long talking down to the very people it was meant to serve. Working-class voters, once Labour's backbone, had been belittled, patronised, and vilified for daring to question its top-down prescriptions. Now they had spoken back. And Farage now stood where Starmer once did, confident, unapologetic, and in command. In Downing Street, the mood had changed irrevocably. Civil servants who once bustled with administrative zeal now moved gingerly, avoiding eye contact, fearful of even speaking Starmer's name aloud. The cabinet room remained untouched since that morning, papers scattered, coffee cooling in half-empty mugs, chairs vacant. There was no authority left. Only silence. Even Starmer's closest allies had gone quiet. They knew that to continue backing him would only ensure their own political downfall. He was no longer seen as a prime minister. He was seen as a man who had lost the room, lost the house, lost the country. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage's team moved with swift, clinical purpose. As Labour drowned in internal panic, Farage was already reaching out to potential allies, preparing to form a government not from the ashes of the old, but in defiance of everything it had represented. From disillusioned former Conservative MPs appalled by their party's drift into irrelevance, to long sidelined independents shut out by the Westminster Club, Nigel Farage did not need to build his coalition on empty promises or cynical alliances. He simply extended an invitation to those who had watched the system disintegrate. They came, willingly, decisively. Journalists called it an insurgency. But for those watching, it felt more like a purging. A reckoning long overdue, a cleansing of a political elite that had for too long patronized and sneered at the public. Outside Parliament, the protests had transformed into jubilant celebration. Crowds chanted, "He's gone." Union flags flew high. There were tears in the streets, not of despair, but of release. Tears from people who, for years, had felt powerless, voiceless, mocked. Farage hadn't just ascended, he had unearthed a deeper truth buried beneath decades of political spin. Starmer's power, it turned out, was never truly his. It had been borrowed, protected by silence, propped up by media narratives that now lay in ruins. Panic swept through Broadcasting House. The BBC scrambled to rewrite their scripts. ITV cut into programming, scrambling for live coverage. Channel 4 hauled in emergency pundits to analyze a moment they barely understood. But the public didn't need experts to explain what had happened. They could see it plainly. They could feel it. Keir Starmer hadn't just lost power, he had been exposed. This was the man who had pushed for digital ID systems, state-level financial monitoring, and the cultural shaming of dissenters. Now he was being escorted out of Downing Street under a wall of camera flashes, the symbol of a defeated era. Inside Parliament, a press conference had been hastily arranged. Journalists packed into the hall, hoping for one last comment before Starmer disappeared into political irrelevance. He arrived late, no entourage, his tie loose, his eyes bloodshot. He looked out over the room and paused. Then, for the first time in months, he spoke without rehearsed lines. The country has spoken. The House has responded. I will not contest the Speaker's declaration. And that was it. No defiance, no hollow appeals to duty or public service. Just quiet surrender. Across Britain, the announcement was met with stunned silence, and then a wave of conversation. Radio phone-ins lit up. Some callers were angry, some euphoric, but most were simply awed. The fall of a prime minister, not through scandal or conspiracy, but through recognition. The public had seen Starmer for what he truly was, a cold functionary. A man who could command, but never connect. And in the end, that failure proved fatal. On social media, Labour backbenchers began quietly deleting old tweets. PR firms were inundated with desperate calls from former cabinet ministers begging for image repair. But the political rot was too deep. The public had passed judgment. Labour wasn't simply out of favour. It was finished, at least in its current form. Its leader had fallen. Its core support had collapsed. And in his place stood a man the system had spent decades ridiculing, marginalising, and fearing. Nigel Farage. But Farage hadn't clawed his way into number 10 through corruption or dark arts. He had spoken, clearly, directly, and the country had listened. In an age saturated with spin, slogans, and obfuscation, he had cut through with unflinching clarity. And in that clarity, Britain found its voice. The news reverberated far beyond Whitehall. International broadcasters interrupted scheduled programming to report the unprecedented scenes unfolding in Westminster. Nigel Farage, declared next Prime Minister by Speaker of the House, flashed across screens from Sydney to Singapore. Global elites, from Brussels to Washington to Davos, were left reeling. They hadn't seen it coming. But for millions across the United Kingdom, it wasn't just possible. It was overdue. In a single night, the country changed. Not in theory. In truth. The establishment had fractured. Sir Keir Starmer, once vaunted as the safe pair of hands, had not been brought down by riots or rebellion. He had been defeated by silence. By a public that no longer believed in him. By a parliament that finally listened. He had relied on order, control, compliance. But once the people spoke, and Parliament followed, the script disintegrated. He hadn't merely lost office. He had lost the illusion that had shielded him from democratic judgment. And with that collapse, the old guard began to fall. Angela Rayner vanished from view. Rumours spread that she had left London entirely, retreating with a close circle of allies to a private estate to re-evaluate the wreckage. Rachel Reeves attempted a brief press appearance, but it was cut short as journalists grilled her mercilessly on Labour's collapse in real time. She walked off stage, visibly shaken. The press no longer shielded Labour. They had moved on. They had a new story to tell, the implosion of a party, and the rise of a man once laughed off by the Westminster class. The Conservative Party, already splintered into irrelevance, attempted to spin the moment as yet another chapter in Britain's populist instability. But no one was listening. Their warnings rang hollow. For years, both Labour and the Tories had played a theatrical rivalry, pretending to oppose one another while safeguarding the same global interests, advancing the same agenda, and suppressing the same dissenting voices. Now, they were both irrelevant. A new force had entered the room. And it wasn't asking permission. Nigel Farage addressed the nation the following morning. No carefully curated backdrop. No sleek campaign slogans. Just a man at a podium, staring directly into the lens, steady, unflinching. A man who looked as though he had waited his entire life for this moment. The people have reclaimed their voice. The days of being ignored are over. From now on, you will be heard. It wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration. A warning. A rupture in the fabric of post-war British politics. And across the country, it hit like thunder. In pubs and cafes, on buses and high streets, the country buzzed. Farage had not merely condemned the elite, he had named them. He called out the bankers who oversaw account surveillance. He tore into Starmer's digital obsession, his control-fixated censorship drives, his quiet war against Britain's working class, all waged from the safety of gated communities and chauffeured cars. And Farage promised it would end. Within hours, lists circulated of those tipped for key cabinet positions. But these were not names from the usual revolving door of party donors, university roommates, or think tank technocrats. They were people who had lived outside the system, fought against it. Former whistleblowers, small business owners, veterans, sacked journalists, working men and women whose voices had long been silenced. This was no reshuffle. It was revolution. Meanwhile, Labour collapsed into chaos. Letters of no confidence poured in from dozens of MPs, regional party offices closed their doors. Staff were warned their jobs were at risk. In the north, Labour councillors began resigning en masse. One resignation letter, leaked to the press, captured the sentiment plainly. We abandoned the people who built this country. And now, they've abandoned us. The media scrambled to soften the blow. They called it a surprising shift in British democracy. An unexpected transition. But no one believed that. This wasn't unexpected. This had been building for years, through every sneer, every slur, every time someone was mocked as far-right for defending borders or sneered at as a flag waver for loving their country. This was the backlash. And it had arrived, unapologetic and undeniable. Even the Speaker of the House, once a background figure in Britain's constitutional theatre, had become the unexpected linchpin. His extraordinary announcement that, by parliamentary consensus, Nigel Farage was to be recognised as Prime Minister, shattered the myth that power was untouchable, insulated from popular will. In that moment, he reminded the world, power rests with the people, not the parties. And then the dominoes fell. Trade unions, long stalwart defenders of Labour, called on Keir Starmer to resign his seat entirely. Universities rescinded his speaking invitations. Think tanks, once aligned with his vision, released damning reports accusing his government of having presided over historic levels of alienation and institutional mistrust. He was no longer a leader. He was a pariah. The most powerful scenes, however, were not in Westminster but in forgotten parts of the country. In the Midlands, pensioners wept on doorsteps, finally feeling that their voices mattered again. In former mining towns of the north, lifelong Labour voters ceremonially tore up their party cards. In chapels and community centres, people lit candles, not out of ritual, but out of hope that their communities might finally be heard. In Scotland and Wales, Farage's message crossed nationalist boundaries. He wasn't speaking in regional dialects, he was speaking a language deeper than borders, class, representation, sovereignty. And the world was watching. The EU convened emergency meetings. Washington issued a cautious statement urging stability and ongoing partnership, all while anxiously watching Britain's new trajectory. Lobbyists and corporate strategists huddled behind closed doors. A major Western democracy had slipped from their grasp, and they knew it. Because Farage had no strings. He wasn't installed. He wasn't selected by Davos panels or Silicon Valley checkbooks. He had been chosen, by people, not portfolios. Not groomed, but summoned by a nation that had reached breaking point. And as the dust began to settle, a strange calm swept the country. Not naive. Not euphoric. But real. There was a sense, raw, unmistakable, that something had changed. Something deep. Power had shifted, not between red and blue, but between the rulers and the ruled. Starmer was last seen being driven from Downing Street in a car with tinted windows, reportedly to a private residence in Surrey. No statement. No farewell. Just silence. A man who once stood at the very centre of Britain's political machine now reduced to a footnote in the history books. His fall was not tragic. It was inevitable. And as the sun set over Westminster, it wasn't simply a political transition. It was spiritual. A collective exhale. The people had spoken. Parliament had listened. The old order, its scaffolding of spin, media complicity, and globalist consensus, had collapsed. And in its place, something unpredictable had risen. His name was Nigel Farage. And he wasn't going anywhere. But as the celebrations fade, a heavier question lingers: what now? Farage may have walked through the door of number 10. But the true battle has only just begun. Can he dismantle the entrenched machinery that has gripped Westminster for decades? Can he outmaneuver a civil service trained to resist disruption? Can he withstand the pressure when the smear campaigns return, as they inevitably will? Because make no mistake, the establishment may be wounded, but it is not dead. The BBC, The Guardian, international financiers, and global think tanks, they are already regrouping. They will not go quietly. They will try to shame the public into submission once more. So now, the question is not about Farage. It's about you. Will you stay awake? Or will you be lulled back to sleep? Because this isn't merely the story of one man toppling another. It's the story of a wall cracking. Of a lie exposed. Of a nation remembering its power. The people now know that change is possible. But only if they demand it, relentlessly. So, what do you believe? Has Britain reclaimed its future? Or is this just the calm before the next storm? Let us know in the comments. Are you part of the rising tide? Or do you still trust the same voices that led us here?